Welcome to History Date Night, a World War II podcast covering the Second World War in chronological order, from the opening shots to final victory. I'm Justin, and joining me is my wife and co-host, Jenny. Together we explore the people, battles, and turning points that shape the deadliest conflict in human history, one date at a time. On this episode, the Three Stooges were different.
The word is dead.
The German government is furious.
Welcome back to History Date Night. I'm Jenny. Last episode, we left Finland celebrating in the streets after destroying 2 Soviet divisions at Suomussalmi and the Raute Road. And we watched a German courier plane make an emergency landing in Belgium with the invasion plans for France in its briefcase. This episode, January 11th through 20th, the Winter War settles into a strange suspended state. Not peace, not the furious fighting of December, but a pause with menace in it. The Soviet Union is learning from its failures and building something better.
I'm Justin. This episode also has the first women pilots delivering aircraft for the RAF, a breakthrough on the Enigma code, Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet premiering under a wartime blackout, the Three Stooges taking on Hitler, a resistance leader hunted through Warsaw Street, and the Vatican Radio broadcasting Nazi atrocities to the world. The phony war is still quiet on the Western Front, but almost nowhere else. January 17th, in Europe. The cold snap that has been building for weeks reaches its peak. The River Thames freezes over for the first time since 1888. On the Norwegian-Swedish border, the mercury freezes inside thermometers. The temperature is too low for them to function. The Danube River in Hungary is completely frozen, trapping 1,200 ships. In Belgium, the coldest temperature ever recorded in that country, minus 30 Celsius, is measured in the valley of the Lesse River. German mines laid off of Heligoland Island are being triggered by drifting ice flows. A German ship is sunk by an actual iceberg off of Iceland. And on the Finnish front, the temperature drops to minus 45 degrees Celsius in places.
To put that in American terms, minus 45 Celsius is minus 49 Fahrenheit. It is the temperature at which exposed skin freezes in minutes, at which mechanical equipment fails, at which diesel fuel gel in tanks and vehicles just stop working. This is the temperature at which the Winter War is being fought. The Soviet troops in the forest pockets, what the Finnish called motis that we described last episode, the isolated sections of columns cut off by Finnish ski troops. Well, the Soviets are in those temperatures without adequate shelter, without food, and in some cases, without winter clothing at all. Soviet planning had expected a 2-week war in November, but nobody had packed for February.
While the Finnish forests are doing much of the killing, the Soviet High Command is doing something more consequential than attacking. It is learning. General Semyon Timoshenko, the new commander of the Soviet forces in Finland, arrives to find an army that has been humiliated and doesn't fully understand why. His diagnosis is clinical. There had been no coordination between different types of units. Artillery hadn't been plotted against specific targets. It was simply aimed in a general direction. Field commanders could not call in supporting fire even when it existed. Friendly fire was commonplace. Retraining begins from top to bottom.
One officer watching these events closely is Georgy Zhukov, whose victory over the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol the previous summer has made him one of the Soviet Union's rising stars. The new battle plan is called Gnawing Through. An armored wedge will pierce the Mannerheim line, waves of infantry will break the whole sector, and the Finns will abandon the entire position. It sounds like what they tried in December, but it is not what they tried in December.
Behind Soviet lines, a full-scale model of the Suma sector of the Mannerheim Line has been constructed. Every bunker, every anti-tank obstacle, every trench, mapped from aerial reconnaissance and replicated in life size on Soviet training grounds. Armor, infantry, and artillery are drilling together, learning to coordinate in real conditions rather than in theory. Balloon spotters with radios will direct fire from high above the battlefield. New heavy tank designs, including prototypes of what would become the famous KV-1, are being tested against the Mannerheim Line, and 2,800 heavy guns, including enormous railway guns, are being positioned for what comes next.
Timoshenko tells Stalin he can break through the Mannerheim Line. He He also tells him that unlike what the previous generals promised, it will not be cheap in lives. Stalin makes him one promise in return. He will not be held responsible for the dead. That is the negotiation at the top of the Red Army in January 1940. The offensive, when it comes, will not arrive until February. Finland has a few more weeks. The Finnish generals know it, and the more clear-eyed of them know that what comes next will be harder than December.
While Timoshenko prepares, the fighting in Finland's forests goes on. The situation the Finns now face is described well by the Finnish general commanding that sector. General Voldemar Hagelund has 160,000 Soviet troops in an area of roughly 100 square miles north of Lake Ladoga, most of them in Motis, the isolated pockets cut off from resupply and surrounded by Finnish ski troops. Hagelund cannot let them regroup, so Finnish reinforcements are called in until he has nearly 50,000 men managing and eliminating the surrounded Soviet forces.
The Moti situation has its own terrible consequences. The trapped Soviet forces dig in with their tanks and artillery, and the Finns have no choice but to surround them. Food supplies dry up. Some food is airdropped, but the Finns intercept much of it, and what gets through is never enough. Soviet doctrine, written in manuals and enforced by orders from above, states that all territory taken must be held to the last man. So the men in the Motis cannot retreat. They cannot surrender without the order. They wait in minus 40-degree temperatures, getting weaker, and they either starve or freeze.
On the Karelian Isthmus, where the main Soviet thrust is stalled against the Mannerheim Line, a different and almost absurd kind of warfare is developing. The Soviets bring loudspeaker trucks to the front and begin broadcasting propaganda programs toward Finnish lines. Music, speeches by the puppet leader Kuusinen, appeals to the Finnish working class, etc. The Finnish soldiers start looking forward to these broadcasts, actually. The music is refreshing, and the Red Army artillery has orders to cease firing during Kuusinen's speeches so that the Finns won't miss a word. The Finnish troops use the speech time to run to the toilet. The propaganda ceasefire is the most useful thing the broadcasts deliver.
Soviet air power is being used more aggressively this week, trying to compensate for the stalled ground campaign. On January 14th alone, 35 Finnish towns are bombed. Turku, Finland's major southwestern port city on the Baltic coast, where most foreign aid arrives, has 80% of its docking facilities destroyed. Viipuri, Finland's second city on the Karelian Isthmus, is being systematically flattened by railway guns firing from Leningrad, roughly 30 miles away. Mannerheim's own headquarters at Mikkeli, a small city in south-central Finland, about 140 miles northeast of Helsinki, is destroyed by airstrikes. The Finns fight back.
But most of Finland is rural wilderness. The targets that matter, railway junctions, supply depots, can mostly be repaired within hours. Tracks are relayed, trains are running again the same day they're bombed in some cases. The total estimated production time lost to all Soviet bombing rates is about 5%. The Soviet Air Force is large, active, and yet not achieving a decisive result. Helsinki itself is largely spared after the first days of the war. One theory is that the Soviets didn't want to accidentally kill foreign journalists or embassy staff and further damage their international reputation, which had already been suffering badly from the League of Nations expulsion.
January 11th, Britain. The women's section of the Air Transport Auxiliary delivers its first aircraft from a factory to an RAF depot. The ATA, Air Transport Auxiliary, was established to ferry aircraft from factories and repair depots to operational squadrons, freeing trained RAF pilots for combat. It was originally staffed by men considered unfit for regular service, like older pilots, men with minor disabilities, experienced civilian flyers. ATA was said to stand for Ancient and Tattered Airmen. When the women were added, they became known as the Atta Girls.
The 9 women in the initial group, one first officer named Pauline Gower, commanding 8 second officers, have over 7,500 hours of flying time between them. The youngest, Joan Hughes, is 22 years old. She learned to fly at 17 before she left school and is already a qualified flying instructor. These are not novelty recruits. There is public protest about it anyway, complaints that trained men are sitting idle on RAF waiting lists while women take the ferrying jobs. The protests are noted but not acted upon. The program instead expands. By the war's end, women ATA pilots will have ferried over 300,000 aircraft of 147 different types, including Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Lancaster bombers, despite none of them being allowed to fly operationally.
On January 17th, in Paris, a breakthrough happens. Polish cryptographers, the same mathematicians who fled Poland with 2 Enigma machines in October and delivered them to the French intelligence, they cracked the Luftwaffe Enigma key from October 28th of the previous year. These breakthroughs demonstrated that German communications could be read and laid important groundwork for the intelligence successes that would follow. Combined with work at Bletchley Park in England on January 14th, where British cryptologists with Polish expert assistance made their own breakthrough, the Allied ability to read German military communications is now entering a new phase. The implications won't be felt fully for months, but the moment matters. Those 2 suitcases carried out of a collapsing Poland in October, containing the machines and the knowledge, are now yielding results.
And on January 11th in Leningrad, the former Petrograd, now today known as St. Petersburg, Russia's great northwestern port city on the Gulf of Finland. Leningrad is under wartime blackout conditions with Soviet bombs occasionally falling on Finnish cities just across the border. The Kirov Theater presents the Russian premiere of Sergei Prokofiev's ballet, Romeo and Juliet. It is one of the great works of 20th century music. It premiered in Czechoslovakia in 1938. The famous Bolshoi Theater had been afraid to perform it, worried the choreography was undanceable. So, the Kirov Theater does it first in Russia. The audience sits in a blacked-out city listening to Shakespeare translated through music in a country that's at war with its neighbor. History doesn't pause for art, and art doesn't pause for history. On January 19th, in New York City, Columbia Pictures releases a short film called You Nazi Spy, starring the Three Stooges. Mo Howard plays a wallpaper hanger named Mo Hailstone, who is installed as a dictator of a fictional country called Moronica, or Moronica. He decorates the country with a flag bearing snakes entwined in the shape of a swastika. The slogan of Moronica is Moronica for Morons. There is a beer hall putsch, a book burning, and an innocent man sent to a, quote, concentrated camp. The film ends with Hailstone and his cronies being eaten by lions, and the final shot is a lion wearing the Reichsfuhrer's hat, burping.
Mo Howard is the first American actor to portray Hitler on screen. This predates Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator by 9 months. According to later stories, Mo Howard's portrayal earned him a place on Hitler's enemies list. The context matters. Through the 1930s, Hollywood had been deeply reluctant to make anti-Nazi films. The studios had European markets. 35,000 theaters across Europe showed American films regularly, and films that criticized Nazi Germany would be banned there. The Hays Code, the industry's self-censorship mechanism, specifically prohibited films that might cause international offense. Major studios avoided the subject entirely.
The Three Stooges were different. All 3 men came from Jewish immigrant families who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. They were not going to be silent. They wore their Jewishness, as one historian puts it, unselfconsciously. And in January 1940, while the real dictator supervising the destruction of European civilization, 3 men with mops and buckets are making America laugh at him. The film is a hit. The sequel, I'll Never Heil Again, comes out in July 1941.
On January 19th in Warsaw, a wanted poster appears on city walls offering a reward for the capture of a man described as the Jew Andrzej Kot. Kot is the leader of the PLAN, the Polish People's Independence Action, an underground resistance organization in occupied Warsaw. He is the son of parents who converted from Judaism to Catholicism, studied in England, and returned to Poland at the start of the war to found the resistance. He has escaped from Gestapo headquarters once already. The arrests that follow touch hundreds of people. By August, when the Gestapo releases 2 lists of those detained in the Kot affair, the lists are headed with single words. One list of 165 names, the word is dead. The second list of 90 names, the word is alive. The families of those on the second list never see them again.
Also on January 19th, Vatican Radio and the Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano broadcast and publish what they describe as the dreadful cruelties of uncivilized tyranny being inflicted on both Jewish and Catholic Poles in German-occupied Poland. This isn't just a government report or resistance pamphlet. This is the official news service of the Catholic Church broadcasting to the world in multiple languages, describing what is happening in Poland. The German government is furious. This broadcast doesn't change anything that is happening, but it is on the record, broadcast from Vatican City in January 1940.
Senator William Borah, the Republican senator from Idaho who was the leading voice of American isolationism in Congress, the man who coined the phrase phony war, and who spent his last years fighting to keep America out of European entanglements, dies of a cerebral hemorrhage in Washington on January 19th. He is 74 years old. His death doesn't end the isolationist movement, but it removes its most prominent and principled spokesman at the moment when the arguments for engagement are getting harder to ignore. Roosevelt, who has been carefully pushing against the boundaries of neutrality for months, notes Borah's passing with the private acknowledgement that the political landscapes have shifted.
On January 20th, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, gives a national radio broadcast. He is not yet Prime Minister, that is still 4 months away, but he is already the most compelling voice in the British government, and he is using that voice to speak to the neutral nations of Europe. The speech is addressed primarily to them, to Norway, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the others who are watching the war from the sidelines, trying to stay out of it, hoping that if they keep their heads down, the storm will pass them by.
He begins with Finland. He condemns the Soviet invasion directly, calling it an act of aggression by a vast, powerful, and ruthless military power. He says the Finns are fighting with the martial vigor and skill that has astonished the world. But he doesn't stop at admiration. He is building towards something much larger. He asks the neutral nations to consider what is happening in Europe. He says there is no chance of a speedy end to the war, except through united action. He tells them to consider what it would mean to stand together.
The speech ends with a passage that has stayed in the historical record, not for its strategic content, but for its image. Churchill says, "The day will come when the joy bells will ring again throughout Europe, and when victorious nations, masters not only of their foes, but of themselves, will plan and build in justice, in tradition, and in freedom, a house of many mansions, where there will be room for all."
A house of many mansions. In January 1940, with Poland erased, with Czech students imprisoned for attending a funeral, with Warsaw starving at 70 deaths per day, with Finnish civilians sheltering from Soviet bombers, with resistance fighters being sorted into lists headed dead and alive. Churchill is describing a future where there is room for all. It is an act of extraordinary will to see that future from where he is standing. Churchill's speech reinforced German fears that Britain might intervene in Scandinavia, concerns that were already influencing planning for what would become the Norwegian campaign.
So, the Winter War settles into a strange suspended state, kind of like the phony war. The Soviet Union is learning from its failures and building something stronger. The Three Stooges take on Hitler. A resistance leader is hunted through Warsaw streets. The Vatican Radio broadcasts Nazi atrocities. And Winston Churchill describes a future house of many mansions while Europe is still burning. Next episode, the Winter War enters a brutal phase as Timoshenko's rebuilt Red Army prepares to break the Mannerheim Line. The pause is ending. Thanks for joining us for episode 18 of History Date Night. We'll see you next time.
See you then.